remember. It happened a few years ago, but what a great weekend and opportunity that we have that the church's birthday, Pentecost, happy birthday, by the way, it coincides with Memorial Weekend. What two great holidays where we have in the faith and then in the secular world where they collide and they share so much meaning for our lives. We're fortunate today that we get those one and the same, and they come with so much power and with so much meaning. And so I'm glad you're here. I'm glad you're a part of this to share in this great day. I told the Cripes as they came in that they were gluttons for punishment or something as they show up to Pentecost, which is the day of the holy fire coming down upon them, and they've experienced enough fire. I'm amazed they care to have anymore. But thank God that when we are in the wrong place, it still works out in God's time, and that the meter reader was able to be there to catch the fire as it started, so that it didn't become any worse. We're glad you guys are all okay. My grandfather, Don Keith Orr, was about 6'1". He weighed about 190 pounds. He had coal black hair until late in his life. In his late 60s, it finally started to gray up a little bit, which was odd because my grandmother, Meemaw, her hair had turned white at the age of 22. And so for pretty much their entire marriage, they would go around and people would always ask her, particularly later in life as a few wrinkles began to appear, if Don was her son. Is this your son? Is this Johnny? And she was never insulted, and I'm sure Papa always got a kick out of it. He had a tooth, a gap between his two front teeth. This is a genetic trait that he passed down to his grandkids. Unfortunately for most of us, it closed up as we got older, but we saw it in Jada when she was young. We see it in my niece as well. The summer that I just finished 6th grade, my family had to move into a small house. It was a 2-bedroom, 4-room house because we had lost everything from my dad's meat shop had gone under. And so they had this house that they rented, and they gave it to us because we had nowhere to live. We lost the house when the business went under. And so we lived there starting the middle of my 6th grade year. That summer, Paul came to me, he was retired, and we shared a driveway with them that came off of Fountain City Road. And then about 50 yards in, it split, and one half of it went up the hill to their house, and the other half went down the hill to our house and to his garage. And he came to me and he said, you're going to help me this summer. We're going to pour concrete in the driveway so that we don't have to worry about regrading the driveway when the rains come and wash it out and dig these trenches that make it difficult for the cars to go up and down. And I thought, well, okay. This was also the same year that my other grandfather said, I think you're old enough to start working in the hayfields. You're going to go out and start working in the hayfields with me. So I had gone out and done that already with him, and he paid me 10 cents a bale, which was great when you're in 6th grade because his fields were about 250 bales. That was $25. And in 6th grade, $25, you are a king. And so this was great. I thought, man, that's wonderful. I'll go pour concrete with Pawpaw. And so he had a trailer, he had a lawn tractor, and he had a trailer that he pulled behind it that was about 4x3. And we would go down into the riverbed that was dried out when it wasn't raining, and we would fill it with river gravel, and then we would bring it up, and we would put it through a sifter and separate all the big rocks. So we had a nice fine sand that we would then haul up to an area, and we would frame up the block that we were pouring, usually about an 8-foot by 8-foot section. And he had his own concrete mixer, and we would begin working, pouring concrete in pads on this driveway that ran down from the street and up the hill and down the hill and was about 16 to 20 feet wide all the way around. And it was hard work. He said, this will make you strong. This will be good for you. And in my mind, I kept thinking, I can't imagine what he's going to pay me. This is going to be fantastic. And the summer went on, and I hadn't received any pay. I thought, well, he'll wait. He's going to wait till we get to the end of summer, no doubt. And the end of summer came, and the school year started, and never saw a penny from him, which frustrated me, and there was no way that I would go and speak to him, because when Pawpaw lectured you, when he was giving you a life lesson, he would do this thing, and 6'1", coal black hair. When you were getting lectured, Pawpaw's eyes would roll up into his head, and he would kind of tilt his head and point his finger, and he spoke as a man possessed, but it was still a very gentle tone. But I didn't want that lecture, and so I didn't ask. And for the next 3 summers, I helped him pour concrete, and not once did I get a penny for that. And I held a little resentment for that for a while, because it was a lot of work that he and I were doing, and I deserved to be paid. Didn't he know? And we lost him a few years ago, and the lessons that I learned back as I think on my grandfather was that he showed me the importance and the pride that comes from hard work. He taught me a solid work ethic, as did my other grandfather. He showed me the joy of a job done right and done well. And those are things that I still hold today, that as I go through my life, that I hope that I have a chance to pass on to my kids. And I hope that, and I told Cammie this, I hope that there are times for my kids where they can have hard, miserable, agonizing, frustrating summers, that they can learn those lessons, that later in life they'll realize what had been given to them. And so, Kathy, if you need a driveway poured down to the creek, Jim and Asher can get started on that real soon. The scriptures speak about 160 times about remembering. And the remembering comes in a number of different ways. Sometimes it's God, where God remembers the covenant. Particularly when the Israelites were in Egypt and they were crying out, it says that God remembered his covenant that he had with Abraham. And he heard the cries of the Israelites crying out in Egypt, and he sought to pursue them. At other times it calls us. In fact, one of the most important commandments starts with remember the Sabbath. Remember to take rest. And in fact, the Sabbath has so much meaning in the Jewish faith because it's about creation. It's about remembering that seventh day, that God has created this world, and even in it, he stepped back to enjoy it. Not rest out of exhaustion, but he rested so that he can enjoy the world and the work that had gone into it. And so the Sabbath is that call that we would remember to play, to enjoy family, to make love, to enjoy a time off, right? We say, oh, I would love to have a day to sleep in. I would love to have a day to be lazy, to not do anything. And God puts that in his commandments. Remember the Sabbath. Do nothing. Relish in the joy of creation and just being. Remember the Sabbath. And that Sabbath then is also a reminder that we would remember the Exodus, that God let them out of Egypt, and that we would remember, in fact, in the Jewish Pentecost, this is the day that they celebrate Moses going up on the mountain and receiving the law from God. And so the Ten Commandments and that remember the Sabbath is also that. Remember that God has given you the law. Remember that God has shown you how to live in a communion with him. That there is a way that the world works, and that God calls you to live in which life, when it's lived in this way, it makes sense. And when you live apart from that, when you push back from that, life will certainly push back at you. And we've all seen that in our lives or the lives of those around us, that when they live apart from the ways that God has called us, that life will push back, and will push back in a hard way. because there is a meaning and a purpose. Remember that, God says. Remember the Sabbath. Remember what I have made you for. Remember creation. Remember the law. Remember. Remember these things. And it goes on, and in Hebrews 11 and 12, the writer of that goes in this, he goes on this line of the list where he says, remember those who have gone before us, the ancestors of our faith who have paved this way. Think on them and remember them. Now, we remember differently in today's culture than the Jews would have remembered, because the Jews remembered not the facts and not the details only. We got to think about that in the Old Testament, that at night the tribe would sit down, and under the starlight they would be around a campfire, and they would be wrapping up the day of herding the animals and the livestock or tending to the fields. And as they sat there and kind of wound down in the darkness of the night, they would share in the oral tradition of the faith through the stories of the faith. And they would remember. And they would say, tell us again the story of Abraham and Sarah, and how they left everything they knew and had to go where God had called them on a promise. And the idea was that as they remembered and told these stories, they weren't just reliving the past. Instead, they were inviting the past into the present. That as they sat around the campfire and told these stories of Abraham, or told the stories of the Exodus, that those characters and those events became real and present at that time. In fact, it's what the Jews in the old Scripture, that was the view of heaven. That it wasn't about going into a place in the clouds behind a gate with a crystal sea and with pavement of gold. That was not the idea of heaven in the Old Testament. The idea of heaven was, what were you able to do, your livestock, the land, the property, the legacy, to be told from generation to generation. If you were going to live on, it was going to be around this campfire, and the stories that were told, and how long what you had done would pass on from generation to generation to generation. And so when they told these stories, it was as if you were bringing them back to life and into the present, a fourth dimension, where they existed and walked, and that you would know Abraham, and you would know Jacob, and you would know the story of the Israelites in Exodus, because as you told those stories, they became real. That's a very rich view of heaven. That's a very rewarding view of that this is not just about me getting to some place in the life after, but this is about what it is that I do with my life now. And it's about remembering my grandfather and my grandmother and my uncle and dear friends and others and what they have done in their life, so that I can benefit from it now. And do I remember those things? Do I recall those things? Not just in remembering the details, but so they can transform and have an impact on the way that I move forward from this place. And we've talked about the Ebenezer and how this would be the place where you would mark those remembrances, where you would say, this is where God moved. This is where God left his mark. And you would stand a stone up so that other people would see that and would say, something important happened here. And so they would tell the stories of, here is what happened in this land. Here is what happened in this place. And God would become present and become real as we remember. And on the Pentecost in that day, after Jesus had gone to the cross and died, in John we have the story where he comes and he visits with his disciples, and they're locked in a room and they're scared for their life, and Jesus appears there. And he says, peace be with you. And he says, check out the wounds on my hand. Please poke them. Stick your hand in them. Know that they are real. That they are what really happened. That what you saw was not an illusion. And then it says in John that when he was with them, he breathed on them. Ruha in the Hebrew, pneuma in the New Testament, Spirit, that He gave His Spirit to them. And we read that text and we remember all the way back to the garden where God forms man to make the likeness of Himself, because as He looked at creation, He realized that still something was not right. And so He formed man and woman in His creation, and then He breathed Ruha, Spirit, into their life. And in Acts, Luke tells the story that in Acts, the disciples were gathered, and as they waited, a mighty wind began to blow, and fire ignited in them, and the Spirit was given to them. The breath of God was given, that we would be a new creation, that the church would now be the likeness of Christ in the world that is around them, and that we have been given this breath, that we now can go out into the world empowered by the Spirit of God. Remember these things. And on the night that Jesus was betrayed, He sat down with His disciples and He said, "Do this in remembrance of me." That this is my body, that this is my blood. And that we are to go out in that same regard, offering our lives to the very core of who we are, that we would offer our flesh, that we would offer our blood, that we would offer our pride, that we would offer our belongings, that we would offer our comforts and our discomforts, to walk alongside others in life, so that we may be able to tell stories that they may remember. Remember. And in that remembering, make it present, make it real. Not just a story of old, but a reality of the present. And so as we light these candles on this table, and as we come together as community, each one of these names, each person that was thought of, is present and here with us right now. And each moment that you remember them, and each time that you help them come to life again, they are as if someone who is sitting there at the table with you, they are that close. God grants us that promise, and then He offers us the promise that someday again this world will be created new, and you will have a reunion with them and with me just as it was in the beginning. Remember. May the blessings of God go with you, and as you go, may you do this in remembrance of me. If you have not left a message or a thought, you may continue to do so as you leave today. Feel free to list on a note card where God has been present in your life recently, and leave that in the Ebenezer. May God go with you in peace. Amen.